O little town of Bethlehem, how sweet we see thee lie beneath the deep and dreamless sleep. The silent stars go by. That's good. It's so beautiful. It's such a beautiful lilting refrain. It's almost lullabyic. Is that a word? That was all destroyed for me last Christmas because I spent Christmas Eve and Christmas Day in little town of Bethlehem, which is a sprawling, dangerous city. And the evening of Christmas Eve, my son and I, we decided, my son was going traveling anyhow. I had to go to Israel because I've been writing forever a book on the life of David and needed to do some research in situ and walk the valley of Elah and go up to En-Gedi and etc. And we decided that we would spend Christmas Eve and Christmas Day in Bethlehem. I thought this would be wonderful, romantic. It would fulfill all my childhood dreams. And so we got in, and I remember going through the checkpoint at Rachel's tomb, and those of you who know the town will know that it feels like you're entering a maximum security prison because of the massive wall and the guard towers. All the graffiti along them, I guess you wouldn't see that, I suppose, in the inside of a federal prison. But the guard at the checkpoint that we went in looked at our Canadian passports, who had no issue with us going in. All he said was, "Good luck." And in we went, and so it was Christmas Eve when the day part, we drove into the guest house, which was lovely, just a little outside of Bethlehem. And then we drove into town, looked around, and then came back for the evening festivities in the Nativity Square, which again, many of you will know. My son, who was bearded, thickly bearded at that point, a young strapping lad, he's a firefighter in the forests of BC. Thank the Lord, he's got about 6 or 8 inches on me, so he's just a strapping guy, but he's thickly bearded, and he's carrying a water bottle that looks like an incendiary device. It looks actually not unlike a Russian, a World War II Russian hand grenade. It's got this long sort of spout in it. And every 3 steps, he is literally ambushed by security people, usually 5 minimum, up to sometimes 8 or 9, both in military gear and in sort of very slick-looking suits, whatnot. They're undercover, so to speak. And so this happens at 4 or 5 times where he's shaken down. And then finally I said, "Give me that darn thing," and I had an inner pocket, and I put it inside, which totally blew away all sense of that this was actually a security measure, that you could hide something that might be an explosive, but if you're openly carrying it, they would shake you down. All along the rooftops surrounding the square were snipers on high alert, because in Bethlehem they expect that if there's going to be some kind of terrorist incident, it's probably going to happen that night. And it was a party that, quite frankly, we didn't have much energy for. We maybe spent about 45 minutes and we're done with that, and we went back to our room. The next day, we went down, Christmas Day, into the streets of Bethlehem, and we wanted to see the Banskis, so the famous graffiti painter all over the world, and there's a number in the Palestinian territory. And so we went and looked at some of these, and we're near Rachel's tomb, this big wall, major entry point for Bethlehem, and we sort of saw some people gathering down the street, but we didn't think anything of it. When we came back from where we were, it was a full-scale riot. And we were trying to get to our car, but stones, like missiles out of slingshots, that now I sort of get the David story in a way I hadn't before. These slingshots with these huge tethers and these great big pockets, and they're hurling these things, rocks like this, at the wall, because even though it'll do no damage, it sends a message. And finally the police came and tear gassed that thing out of there, and this was our experience of Christmas Day, almost getting our car hit and our heads hit a few times by rocks. All to say, it's hard for me to sing that song now, because the actual experience of being in Bethlehem has displaced or overwritten or eclipsed this wonderful, rich memory that I've had that this is a sleepy little town where stars go silently by. Now, I haven't preached Advent since that. That was just last year at Christmas. My son and I did, actually in Bethlehem, we didn't go back directly back to our guest house. We actually went and took in a lovely service in a Lutheran church just down the street, and it was quite beautiful actually to sing Christmas carols and whatnot and feel sort of like normal Christmas for a moment. But I haven't, I'm scheduled to preach sometime in December at a church in Edmonton, but it's sort of an evening thing, and they've asked me to do something else. So I haven't preached Advent yet. I'm wondering how I would unpack a text now, just given that experience. Because what the experience did is unsettle some impressions I've had about the little town of Bethlehem, and it's hard to reconcile those impressions that have been shaped over 50 years and what I experienced last year. So I don't know what I would do, and that's pretty much the only remark I'm going to actually make about Advent. But it is a segue into what I do want to talk about in the half hour or so I have with you. And that is that sometimes I think preaching is meant to disrupt. That when we preach, we're, in a sense, not necessarily trying to upset people, but unsettle people. And take what has been received opinion, what has been kind of the status quo, conventional wisdom, false certitude, self-congratulations, we could keep listing things, and not sort of a full-on cranky assault on all of that, because obviously a lot of preaching is bringing consolation to people. It's bringing profound comfort, comfort my people. But at the same time, if that's all we're doing, if we're just sort of, in a sense, preaching within the priestly tradition of helping people connect deeply with their faith and the sense of God's presence and blessing, which is a wonderful, wonderful part of what we do when we stand up in pulpits. But if it's all we do, I think at some point we actually lull people into the complacency that we're so easily ensnared by anyhow. So I want to talk about preaching that disrupts, and I want to say a bit more about some broad things, and then I want to go down to some, I think, just strategies that we can find in Scripture where the preaching becomes, it creates a little bit of unbalance in people, a little bit of, it reopens wonder, or or I better sit with this a bit, as my First Nations friends like to say. I need to sit with this. I need to figure out, in other words, it sometimes shifts perspective and paradigms pretty dramatically. Now, I'm going to make the argument, a lot of that is done in a kind of sneaky way. The full-on assault usually doesn't work, but the subversion tactics, which when I talk about parables, I think they're powerfully subversive. And these wonderful little stories about, sheep and sons and, people planting fields and all these sort of things that seem to lull us into life as we know it. But on the other side of it is is that about me? Did he just talk about me? Was that a story? Are we not welcoming people? I think he told that again, it says Peter. I think the Lord just told that parable again. Did you hear that, or am I hearing things? So that's a subversive quality to it. Again, I'm not arguing for stridency or, just getting up there. I had a group of people in the church where I pastored for many years, but once in a while I just sort of worked myself up into some kind of lather. And I'd actually usually be just angry about something. The giving wasn't, where I thought it should be or something. And I'd just be hot and mad, and I would sort of hang a licking on them. And there's a certain group of people that like that. And so I'd always, a lot of people just avoid eye contact as they were leaving that day. But there was, a small percentage of people said, "I like it when you really preach." But I was just mad, to be honest. And just wanted them, to all know. And I needed to vent my spleen. I didn't think it was actually going to have any effect on the giving or whatever I was trying to address. But I just needed to get this off my chest, which is generally not a good posture to come into the pulpit with. So I'm going to argue for that this kind of upending or unsettling preaching kind of takes a different form. Maybe actually I'll go into more detail, but I heard Will Willimon. Well, I've heard him a number of times, and many of you know, I think Dean of Chapel or something at Duke University for years. I might be retired now, but we had him actually a couple years ago to give some lectures at Ambrose where I teach. And if you've ever heard Willimon, he's got this very kind of engaging, he seems to be meandering until he gets you. So he starts out, and he's preaching on John 2, the water and the wine, that text. I know there's more in John 2 than that. There's a clearing of the temple, but the water and the wine. And he starts this, the church I pastored, first church in North Carolina, the worst church that ever existed. Horrible church, terrible. And it just goes on a bit like this. And this is his opening to the John 2. And he nearly closes the sermon by talking about running in a couple years prior to when he spoke at our institution, about running into a young pastor who is now the pastor at this horrible, terrible church. And this pastor talked about what an amazing church it is. And Willimon's like, "What happened there?" And what happened there is this church actually got to the place where they needed so desperately a real touch of God that they cried out, and God actually showed up in a very kind of real and sustained way. But the way that tied into the John 2 text is the refrain that Willimon used: wrong sign, wrong place, wrong miracle. Because, as you see that wonderful quote that you had, Caroline, this guy that shows up at a party and everybody's already well into their cups, right? And it's like, we need more wine. He's like, what's that got to do with me? And then you go, okay, whatever. And so then he makes all this wine. And of course, if you preach that text, this is a super abundance of wine. All those water pots that hold, how many, gallons, and there's 11 or whatever. There's 6 or I don't know. There's a lot of water pots, and he fills them to the brim. That's emphasized. So we got a ton of wine, and it's super good wine. And this is the first miracle, or arche ton someon, maybe the greatest, right? The archetypical miracle. And so his thing is like, who expected that? Wrong miracle, wrong place, wrong thing, wrong sign. The whole point of this sermon was that he can kind of show up anywhere, anyhow he wants. And he can mess with you in ways that you had not anticipated. And so the story of the worst church becoming this amazing church is the story of the God who's just, he could be here. He might be right here. And he might actually be about to transform something in your life. And I walked out of that sermon on high alert. I was just like, he could ambush anywhere. He could show up and do what he's going to do, which is not what you would necessarily predict, quite fit into a religious category. But he's got this surprise and subversive ability to kind of drop into people's lives unannounced, unbidden, and just do stuff. And that's as good a picture as I can come up with in terms of how I experienced the disruptive, unsettling quality of Jesus. I've, again, not only preached the cranky sermons, I've heard lots of them. And I think that doesn't usually have the effect that we're thinking it was going to. But this sort of thing where all the ways I've perceived, received, understood, framed a situation, and suddenly somebody comes and brings fresh language, fresh insight into it, and now I'm walking around like this. I'm on a high alert. Why I think we need preaching like that is there's probably dozens of reasons. I'm going to come up with two, or at least explore two. I already mentioned the complacency. I am first astonished at my own, the inertia of my own heart is toward just being super comfortable and loathing interruption, loathing inconvenience. So an example of this that's quite fresh, I'm having some issue with, I have to fly out later on today, and I'm just got very used to going onto my phone and downloading checking in online and having a little thing that they scan when you go through, and I don't have to do counters and anything. And there's something going on that happened in Calgary. They told me it was fixed, but I can't check in online, so I've got to go, and I had to work on my attitude about that, which is just such a first world problem. But I'm so astonished at just my heart's constant temptation to that which is easy. And to expect that, not be even thankful for that, actually feel profoundly inconvenienced when somehow that is, something throws that off. And so I need something in my life where the sermon is not simply just confirming all the ways I want my world to be, but unsettling me a bit. So the complacency factor is one element. The second element that I'll address is I'm astonished, as probably many of you are, how polarized our current society has become. And again, I could make references to certain things that you're all thinking right now, but I'll try to avoid that. I am longing, I said this, I think to Caroline, I just long for, say, someone of the political stature of a Lincoln or even a Teddy Roosevelt that just had this capacity to honestly attend to the substantive arguments of their opponents and invite it and adjust according to it, rather than demonize it and all of those. But that's not just a political problem. We have it in the religious landscape, where we have whole groups that have locked into some kind of dogmatism that everything becomes an argument why you have to go entrench even further. And that can go on either side, by the way. It can be a problem within the mainstream. It can be a problem within the more conservative things. But this thing where we want to entrench in this position, and anybody who represents or embodies something different, variant from that we tend to kind of, it just pushes us further back on our heels. And so this polarization that I see, I think that we need preaching that sort of comes into all of that and just creates a little bit of dissonance, a little unsettledness, a little, maybe I'm not entirely right. Maybe I need to rethink this. Obviously, maybe I should just say a little more about what we're all watching with some level of fascination, the political campaign south of us. And whichever side you line up on, there's a sort of an inability, generally, as we look at the political climate down there, to kind of say, gosh, that was a good argument. That's a good point. It doesn't matter if it could come from either side. That's a good point. And because I think that there's a lack of that, there's a sense of this growing polarization that we don't know what that could look like in a few weeks. But don't you think that the sermon moment, the preaching moment, should for all people just sort of create a pause, this space, for self-reflection, for a little bit of appropriate self-doubt about what it is that I cherish so deeply, and why. Well, enough of that. That's not comfortable for me to talk about. Preaching, as I said, is a priestly act, but it's also prophetic. It's a prophetic act as well, and so the priestly consoles, the prophetic disturbs. Not that there isn't some profoundly comforting, consoling text. In fact, sometimes when I read the prophets, it's like there's three people talking at each other. And you just sort of zip from one to the other, and you just, how did we get here? You know, one moment this guy, Isaiah or whoever, is really, beating the people over the head and then the next minute he's kind of picking them up and dusting them off and comforting them and all of that. So it sort of seems like this weird kind of back and forth dialogue in the prophets. So, but in general, there's a kind of a disruptive quality often we see in the prophets. So often this waking up and shaking up, this calling us to rethink this thing, to reframe some of the ways we've got settled into a particular way of looking at things, thinking about things, responding to things may not be the best way or the way that aligns us with God. And so there's this sort of prophetic element. Now, I want to take a text really quickly that you actually referenced this morning. And actually, it was a wonderful sort of preparation in some ways for what I want to talk about today. But Caroline talked about this passage in Matthew or Luke's Gospel where Jesus does his inaugural speech. And it's in Luke chapter 4. And, he gets up and everybody's he's handed the scroll. He reads that Isaianic text, Spirit of the Lord is on me, has anointed me. And then it says this in verse 20. Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, today the scriptures fulfilled in your hearing. And all of them fainted. Well, almost, right? All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. Isn't this Joseph's son? They replied. It's like, oh, our little boy. We're so proud of the youth pastor. He just did so well preaching today. We raised him, to think about that, and then he says, truly I tell you, and as you said, it's sort of like, God's mission's big. And the people he's reaching, the people he's using aren't always our kind of people. And so he mentioned somebody from Syria, which of course didn't have the same, well, it sort of does. And then, as Caroline says, all the people in the synagogue who have been looking gaga eyes at him, they're just like, oh, I'm so proud of our little boy. He's so handsome. I didn't know he got so tall. All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove him out of the town, took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him off the cliff. And you gave me a great new word, Leros. BS. We're not taking this. Now, let me just be very, very clear. If you are in the preaching ministry and you preached like Jesus all the time, you would get fired. And you would. I mean, you just simply would. So I think that Jesus was more leaning into the prophetic dimensions of preaching than the priestly. And quite honestly, if you were just utterly in the prophetic mode every time you get up in that pulpit, they will fire you, and probably for good reason. Because that is not really the kind of preaching that over time nourishes a church. But if you never do the prophetic teaching, you never get into that mode. In other words, you never have people wanting to throw you off a cliff. Or as you said, standing up, Leros. Leros is how you say it? Leros. At least you can see it in their eyes, right? Even if they're too polite to get up and say it. If that's not happening, then I think that maybe that some of this preaching that disrupts, unsettles, you may want to consider opening yourself to those texts and preaching them with some faithfulness. Let me just tell a quick story around that. I was doing a series on the Sermon on the Mount. And I decided to memorize the entire Sermon on the Mount in order to kind of introduce the series. But I got up on the Sunday when I cited the Sermon on the Mount from memory, no notes. I just decided I was going to fly without any kind of instruments, and I was going to get up there and I was from memory recite the whole thing. And I did pull it off. It was the shortest and most effective sermon I've ever preached. It took 12 minutes. And people were astonished, like they were at this preaching of Jesus. But we had in our congregation, as Peter knows, we have kind of a very mixed demographic. And a lot of people were very new to Christianity. They not necessarily embraced it. They were checking it out. But never had any church background whatsoever. And I never announced, oh, by the way, I'm going to recite from the Sermon on the Mount. This is a famous sermon from Jesus. I just got up and I started it. And I went through. And then I asked when I'd finished, what did you hear? And this guy at the back actually got up and he said, Leros, more or less. He said, are you out of your bloody mind? He called across, the sanctuary isn't nearly as big as this, but it was fairly far. He called across the heads of all the people, are you out of your bloody mind? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, you think somebody hits me, I'm going to just turn the other cheek. What is that about? And I thought, oh man, this is it. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen the BBC production, I think done in 62, or it might have been in the 50s, called Son of Man. Anybody seen that? It was BBC, an Irish actor whose name eludes me at the moment. I'm trying to remember the guy who scripted it, and it'll come to me in a moment. But anyhow, it's a black and white. It's shown on BBC, scandalized the nation when it was first shown. I think it was 62. And it featured the Jesus you never knew. Dennis Potter was the writer and the director, and I can't remember the Irish actor. But he's kind of pot-bellied. He's hairy all over. He's got this mop of hair. He's got this wild beard. He's disheveled. And the favorite scene I have of it is a kind of a mashup of the Sermon on the Mount. And it begins to frame Jesus preaching on this scene of the brutality of the Roman soldiers in the occupation. So they're just kind of whipping people, trampling people. They're brutal. And then suddenly you hear, "Blessed are the peacemakers." They should, and just this gruff wild man going around, and all these people, and he's saying, "You know, it's easy to love people that, like your family. Go ahead, hug one another. Just go ahead." So he does this thing, and everybody's hugging one another. He says, "Oh, doesn't that feel good? That feels nice, isn't it? Yeah. What I say to you, love your enemy." And people going, no, love your enemy. No, love your enemy. Listen. I'm telling you things that have not been said since the creation of the earth. And it just goes on like this for about 5 minutes. It's quite intense, as you can imagine. And I remember the first time I showed in my preaching class all the time, because this is a Jesus who provokes reaction. And when I just show it to students. I didn't really even set it up. I just tell them this is a little BBC production done in 1960, whenever. And I show them and watch the kind of shock on their face. And then I ask them, "What do you think?" And the number one response of the students is, "That's a Jesus I would follow." Now, I haven't done this because I haven't been able to find it. I saw some years ago another around the same era, though it's a movie in color. It was in that really bright color. What do they call that stuff? Technicolor. It's sort of super colors of Jesus in. I think it's supposed to be the Palestinian desert, but it's somewhere in maybe Nevada. I don't know. And he's sitting around with his disciples on Prozac, I'm sure. And he's doing the Beatitudes, and he's like, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall be filled." And it's absolutely sleep-inducing. So I'm trying to find that, if you know what even the movie that is, that I could pair those things together. There's something about the disruptive quality of Jesus' preaching as it's portrayed in that movie that I think captures probably how his preaching came across in his own day, that unsettles people's, again, received opinions, the conventional wisdom, the way they framed it, the who is my enemy, who is my neighbor, what is God like, that you can watch as that production does it, people's faces just going, I never thought that before. I was supposed to stop now and take questions, but I don't think I'm going to get to them. I'm just going to finish a few more thoughts here. It's 2:15 we end at, right? So we can move off to... Is that correct? Okay.
The next session's 2:30.
Okay, so 2:15, 2:20. Okay, great. Okay, thanks. Jesus, as you know, his homiletical style, and again, we don't know exactly how he, how he embodied it. Caroline, we don't know, was there this sort of wild gesturing of this BBC thing? Was it more sedate? We know he often sat to teach, so you don't get too much movement going on that. We don't know at what tone, the intonation, the volume level, but we do know the effects of much of Jesus' preaching. First of all, we know it annoyed a lot of people, and people you shouldn't annoy, because they tend to kind of, they're the people who serve in the ministries, they're the people who give quite lavishly. And he just had this quality. In fact, it was actually Jesus' preaching ministry that got him in trouble. The things he would say were so unsettling to the people who thought they had already locked all that stuff up, that increasingly led to this mounting, escalating animosity that he had with religious leaders, that finally they felt that they had to eliminate this person as a threat. So it was a preaching ministry that was so unsettling. So he annoyed all kinds of people, and generally the people you shouldn't annoy or alienate. And he attracted all sorts of the people that normally you shouldn't go after. They just came running to him. Now, some of that had to do with his miraculous capacities, and he addresses that later on in terms of their points of attraction. But a lot of it, they just couldn't get enough. So a refrain, it's not quite a refrain, but something we hear with Jesus is, I never heard anything like this or seen anything like this before. It's not like the other guys. The other guys, yeah, it's preaching, but it's sort of standard issue. And this is with some kind of weird authority. I've never heard or seen anything quite like this. Of course, in the Sermon on the Mount, there is that refrain, you have heard it said, but I say to you. So there's a deliberate kind of, I'm now going to mount a bit of a critique of, if not an assault upon, the received opinion. So let me spend my last couple of minutes talking about some of the ways that I've tried to embody some of that prophetic ministry within the preaching that has this unsettling effect. By the way, and let me reinforce again, I think a lot of preaching has to bring comfort to people. People are hurt, they're scared, they're confused, and I think a large part of what we do when we're in the pulpit is we just give people a sense of God is with me. God is here, God loves me. That whole identity thing, Sue, you are the one Jesus loves. But also this other thing that I'm making an argument for, that sometimes it's got to unsettle. So the parables are one of the primary means. Of course, Jesus did say things without a parable. We have that text where he never said anything without a parable. And so there's a sense of the parabolic is functioning in this sly, subversive way I'm talking about. It doesn't, on the surface, seem to be something that would kind of dismantle or in any way call into question the worldview that you already embrace and inhabit. It's the afterward thing that you go, So let's think of the suite of parables in Luke 15, 3 about lost things. The lost coin, lost sheep, lost coin, lost son. I talked a little bit about this the other night. It's set off by the religious people criticizing Jesus for the company he keeps. And as I said last night, there's a subversive quality that really begins right at the start is suppose one of you. So inviting people into a reflection on what it is to lose something that matters to you. So he names stuff that is current with them, right? Most of them have some kind of stake in the game. Agriculturally, they may not be shepherds, but they maybe own some livestock that somebody is looking after, and it's costly when one of those things gets away on you. The whole wedding tiara, the loss of the coin, or however that's to be understood. But there's some kind of valuable thing that falls, through the cracks in the floor, and then the son, or maybe two sons that get away. And so he's inviting people into a reflection of, the things that really matter profoundly to you, that your life actually doesn't quite, as I said last night when we lost Nickel on the beach, your world stops when that thing goes missing. I want you to take a fresh look at this person that you think I shouldn't be hanging out with. I just want you to look at them again, and I want you to reimagine them through the eyes of God. Through the divine supposition, what God values, what God's world stops if that thing gets away on him. And so we see this quality over and over in the parable. Some of them are more pointed. Some of them have a different kind of tonal quality to them. But this pausing to have us reconsider. Now, the most famous parable that's sort of a gotcha is actually the one in 2 Samuel 12, the Nathan with David. And David's a total sucker for sheep stories, right? The guy's shepherd through to the bone. So you start telling him a little ewe lamb story, and that guy just kind of, he doesn't even, if you look at that way that Nathan sets that thing up, there a certain man, once upon a time is how he begins it. So everybody should, anybody who has ears to hear would know this is a little fabulistic thing that's got some kind of great moral comes at the end. But not David. It's like, a sheep? A ewe? A little no, the guy. So he's just totally pulled into the sheep story because it's sort of what he lives and breathes. And then he doesn't see coming. You are the man. So that's a sort of more a direct form of that parabolic style. That's sort of like a gotcha at the end. But all of them, to some degree, function like that. No, I'm not going to take the time. I just heard a modern day one that got me, but I, for the sake of time, I'll move on and leave you tormented by what it was. You talked the other night about the prophetic imagination, or somewhere you talked about Brigham&'s The Prophetic Imagination, that great book written quite a while ago. And I think that's partly also what we bring in this disruptive. The prophets, as I said, there's kind of this back and forth quality, but fundamentally it falls into rebuke and an invitation. The prophets bring these fairly fierce, stinging rebukes to the people. Famously Amos 4:1, you cows of Bashan. That's not something you probably want to say, in your pulpit on a Sunday to the women folk, but bring us a drink, but this fairly startling, upsetting kind of portrait of the complacency, the self-serving attitudes of the people in that day. And then on the other side is anybody thirsty? Isaiah 55, is anybody hungry? But you don't have any money? That's okay. Come and buy the richest affair. We're not talking just stuff that was left over at the food bank. Come, because this is all free. And so this moving back and forth, that the prophetic imagination works in a disruptive or unsettling way on both sides. Sometimes it names things that are hard to hear, as you were talking about, Caroline, today. It's just hard to hear that. It's hard to hear that truth. It hurts, it bites. But on the other side is what God is up to exceedingly abundantly more than I could even ask or imagine. And am I invited into it? Okay. I had more on here, but let me simply end. I think the most unsettling thing we can do as preachers and pastors is profoundly love the people. I mean, that was Jesus, for he so loved. And that love just kept coming out in ways that were profoundly disruptive and subversive, actually. It wasn't some mawkish thing. It wasn't some sentimentalized thing. It was this fierce, holy love with which he loved. So the woman at the well, come meet the man who told me everything I ever did. What did he tell her? You've had 4 husbands or 5 husbands, the one you're living with isn't your husband. Come meet the man who knows everything about me, and he still wants to give himself to me, but not the way other men have wanted to give themselves or have me. Come meet that man. I think that we're seen as a narration of this fierce, holy love. Come meet the love that knows my story and all of its pain, in all of its brokenness and all of the shame, but he doesn't reject me or try to exploit me. I think that's the Messiah. And I found late in the game the power of loving a congregation. Even when they hurt you, and they do. I was, and I'll close with this. I'm sorry that I have to cut this short. I was preaching last summer in a little town in rural Alberta. It was the August long weekend, and frankly, I didn't want to be there. Long story, I won't go into why I was there, why I'd accepted the thing when I didn't want to be there on the long weekend. And but I made this decision. I would go and I would give them the best I had in the speaking moments, but otherwise I was giving them nothing. I wouldn't eat with them. I wouldn't be around them. I would just get on my motorcycle and ride back to someplace, and I'd just come and show up in the pulpit. I had 4 talks, and I'd done 2 of them, and not one person had come up and said anything. And now I'm starting to think I suck. Because I thought I was doing okay, but nobody's saying that was great, that changed my life, or anything. So I'm going into the 3rd talk, and I actually, because of my wounded ego, I say to the Lord, it'd be just great if you could see somebody to encourage me. And finished my 3rd talk, and this young man with Down syndrome comes beelining for me, and I am so thankful just as I watch this young man, because in the church I pastored, there's many people with various disability and lots of people with Down syndrome, and they're just beautiful and always blessed me, and partly because they'll just tell you how it is, and come up and hug me and told me I did great or fist pump me or whatever, and I knew I had preached okay if Alex told me that, and so I was so excited to see that. I'm just thanking God already for this young man who is about to bless me by telling me how awesome I am. And the young guy comes, and I reach out my hand, and he doesn't shake my hand. He gets kind of in my physical space, and he goes, "You're bowing." And I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "You're bowing. Everybody is falling asleep." And I said, "So just so I understand, so I'm boring you?" He says, "No, you're bowing everybody. Everybody's falling asleep." And so I'm so startled, because I think, okay, this is probably Jesus coming and giving me give me the verdict, the final verdict, the sort of the epitaph on my preaching is I'm boring. And so I say to this young man, "Look, help me then. Can you tell me what I could do to not be boring?" And he says, "Tell jokes. Pastor Barry always tells jokes." And I'm like, I just about faint from relief, because I'm like, oh, it's not Jesus, because Jesus wouldn't come and tell me to tell more jokes, so I'm off the hook. And so I get on my motorcycle, I'm pounding out of there, and about 20 minutes down the road, I sense the Lord speaking to me from, as Sue said, that place. And he said, "That was me." I said, "What?" He said, I said, "Are you what? You want me to tell more jokes? I'm not that funny. What do you?" don't you hear what that young man's saying? Help me, Lord. See, Pastor Barry always makes sure he gets included. Let me say it more simply for you, Mark. Pastor Barry loves that young man. And you are just a gun for hire. And my life changed on one motorcycle bounding down the road at 110 that day. And I resolved that I would never, ever stand in a pulpit again. And I did this today, that I wouldn't ever show up and speak of God without loving the people to whom I speak. Thanks.